Chapter 18 of Roads of Destiny. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Scott Foster. Roads of Destiny by O. Henry, Chapter 18, On Behalf of the Management. This is the story of the man-manager and how he held his own until the very last paragraph. I had it from Sully Magoon, viva voce. The words are indeed his, and if they do not constitute truthful fiction, my memory should be taxed with the blame. It is not deemed amiss to point out in the beginning the stress that is laid upon the masculinity of the manager, for, according to Sully, the term, when applied to the feminine division of mankind, has precisely an opposite meaning. The woman manager, he says, economizes, saves, oppresses her household with bargains and contrivances, and looks sourly upon any pence that are cast to the fiddler for even a single jig-step on life's arid march. Wherefore her menfolk call her blessed, and praise her, and then sneak out the back door to see the Galooly sisters do a buck and wing dance. Now the man-manager, I still quote Sully, is a Caesar without a Brutus. He is an autocrat without responsibility, a player who imperils no stake of his own. His office is to enact, to reverberate, to boom, to expand, to out-coruscate, profitably if he can. Bill-paying and growing gray hairs over results belong to his principles. It is his to guide the risk, to be the apotheosis of front, the three-tailed bashaw of bluff, the essential oil of razzle-dazzle. We sat at luncheon, and Sully Magoon told me. I asked for particulars. My old friend Denver Galloway was a born manager, said Sully. He first saw the light of day in New York at 3 years of age. He was born in Pittsburgh, but his parents moved east the third summer afterward. When Denver grew up, he went into the managing business. At the age of 8, he managed a newsstand for the Dago that owned it. After that, he was a manager at different times of a skating rink, a livery stable, a policy game, a restaurant, a dancing academy, a walking match, a burlesque company, a dry goods store, a dozen hotels and summer resorts, an insurance company, and a district leaders campaign. That campaign, when Coughlin was elected on the east side, gave Denver a boost. It got him a job as a manager of a Broadway hotel, and for a while he managed Senator O'Grady's campaign in the 19th. Denver was a New Yorker all over. I think he was out of the city just twice before the time I'm going to tell you about. Once he went rabbit shooting in Yonkers. The other time I met him just landing from a North River ferry. "Been out west on a big trip, Sully, old boy," says he. "Gad, Sully, I had no idea we had such a big country. It's immense. Never conceived of the magnificence of the West before. It's gorgeous and glorious and infinite. Makes the East seem cramped and little. It's a grand thing to travel and get an idea of the extent and resources of our country." I'd made several little runs out to California and down to Mexico and up through Alaska, so I sits down with Denver for a chat about the things he saw. "Took in the Yosemite out there, of course?" I asks. "Well, no," says Denver. "I don't think so. At least, I don't recollect it. You see, I only had 3 days, and I didn't get any farther west than Youngstown, Ohio. About 2 years ago, I dropped into New York with a little flypaper proposition about a Tennessee mica mine that I wanted to spread out in a nice sunny window in the hopes of catching a few. I was coming out of a printing shop one afternoon with a batch of fine, sticky prospectuses when I ran against Denver coming round a corner. I never saw him looking so much like a tiger lily. He was as beautiful and new as a trellis of sweet peas and as rollicking as a clarinet solo. We shook hands, and he asked me what I was doing, and I gave him the outlines of the scandal I was trying to create in mica. "Oh, pooh-pooh for your mica," says Denver. "Don't you know better, Sully, than to bump up against the coffers of little old New York with anything as transparent as mica? Now you come with me over to the Hotel Brunswick. You're just the man I was hoping for. I've got something there in sepia and curled hair that I want you to look at." "You putting up at the Brunswick?" I asks. "Not a cent," says Denver, cheerful. "The syndicate that owns the hotel puts up. I'm manager." The Brunswick wasn't one of them Broadway pothouses all full of palms and hyphens and flowers and costumes. Kind of a mixture of lawns and laundries. It was on one of the East Side avenues, but it was a solid one-time caravansary such as the mayor of Skaneateles or the governor of Missouri might stop at. 8 stories high it stalked up, with new striped awnings, and the electrics had it as light as day. "I've been manager here for a year," says Denver as we drew nigh. "When I took charge," says he, "nobody nor nothing ever stopped at the Brunswick. The clock over the clerk's desk used to run for weeks without winding. A man fell dead with heart disease on the sidewalk in front of it one day, and when they went to pick him up, he was 2 blocks away. I figured out a scheme to catch the West Indies and South American trade. I persuaded the owners to invest a few more thousand, and I put every cent of it in electric lights, cayenne pepper, gold leaf, and garlic. I got a Spanish-speaking force of employees and a string band, and there was talk going round of a cockfight in the basement every Sunday. Maybe I didn't catch the Nut Brown gang. From Havana to Patagonia, the Don Senors knew about the Brunswick. We get the high flyers from Cuba and Mexico and the couple of Americas further south, and they've simply got the boodle to bombard every bullfinch in the bush with. When we got to the hotel, Denver stops me at the door. "There's a little liver-colored man," says he, "sitting in a big leather chair to your right inside. You sit down and watch him for a few minutes and then tell me what you think." I took a chair while Denver circulates around in the big rotunda. The room was about full of curly-headed Cubans and South American brunettes of different shades, and the atmosphere was international with cigarette smoke, lit up by diamond rings and edged off with a whisper of garlic. That Denver Galloway was sure a relief to the eye. 6'2" he was, red-headed and pink-gilled as a sun perch, and the air he had. Court of St. James, Chauncey Olcott, Kentucky Colonels, Count of Monte Cristo, Grand Opera. All these things he reminded you of when he was doing the honors. When he raised his finger, the hotel porters and bellboys skated across the floor like cockroaches, and even the clerk behind the desk looked as meek and unimportant as Andy Carnegie. Denver passed around, shaking hands with his guests, and saying over the 2 or 3 Spanish words he knew until it was like a coronation rehearsal or a Bryan barbecue in Texas. I watched the little man he told me to. 'Twas a little foreign person in a double-breasted frock coat, trying to touch the floor with his toes. He was the color of V.C. Kidd, and his whiskers was like Excelsior made out of mahogany wood. He breathed hard, and he never once took his eyes off of Denver. There was a look of admiration and respect on his face, like you see on a boy that's following a champion baseball team, or the Kaiser William looking at himself in a glass. After Denver goes his rounds, he takes me into his private office. "What's your report on the dinghy I told you to watch?" he asks. "Well," says I, "if you was as big a man as he takes you to be, 9 rooms and bath in the Hall of Fame, rent-free till October 1st, would be about your size." "You've caught the idea," says Denver. "I've given him the wizard grip and the cabalistic eye. The glamour that emanates from yours truly has enveloped him like a North River fog. He seems to think that Senor Galloway is the man who. I guess they don't raise 74-inch sorrel tops with romping ways down in his precinct. Now, Sully," goes on Denver, "if you was asked, what would you take the little man to be?" "Why," says I, "the barber around the corner, or, if he's royal, the king of the bootblacks." "Never judge by looks," says Denver. "He's the dark horse candidate for president of a South American republic." "Well," says I, "he didn't look quite that bad to me." Then Denver draws his chair up close and gives out his scheme. "Sully," says he with seriousness and levity, "I've been manager of one thing and another for over 20 years. That's what I was cut out for, to have somebody else to put up the money and look after the repairs and the police and taxes while I run the business. I never had a dollar of my own invested in my life. I wouldn't know how it felt to have the dealer rake in a coin of mine. But I can handle other people's stuff and manage other people's enterprises. I've had an ambition to get hold of something big, something higher than hotels and lumberyards and local politics. I want to be manager of something way up, like a railroad or a diamond trust or an automobile factory. Now here comes this little man from the tropics with just what I want, and he's offered me the job." "What job?" I asks. "Is he going to revive the Georgia Minstrels or open a cigar store?" "He's no coon," says Denver. "He's General Rumpiro. General Jose Alfonso Sapolio Juan Rumpiro. He has his cards printed by a news ticker. He's the real thing, Sully, and he wants me to manage his campaign. He wants Denver C. Galloway for a president maker. Think of that, Sully, old Denver romping down to the tropics, plucking lotus flowers and pineapples with one hand and making presidents with the other. Won't it make Uncle Mark Hanna mad? And I want you to go too, Sully. You can help me more than any man I know. I've been herding that brown man for a month in the hotel so he wouldn't stray down 14th Street and get roped in by that crowd of refugee tamale eaters down there. And he's landed, and DCG is manager of General JASJ Rompiro's presidential campaign in the great republic of... what's its name? Denver gets down an atlas from a shelf, and we have a look at the afflicted country. 'Twas a dark blue one on the west coast, about the size of a special delivery stamp. From what the general tells me, says Denver, and from what I can gather from the encyclopedia and by conversing with the janitor of the Astor Library, it'll be as easy to handle the vote of that country as it would be for Tammany to get a man named Johann appointed on the White Wings Force. Why don't General Rump Tyro stay at home, says I, and manage his own canvass? You don't understand South American politics, says Denver, getting out the cigars. It's this way. General Rumpiro had the misfortune of becoming a popular idol. He distinguished himself by leading the army in pursuit of a couple of sailors who had stolen the plaza, or the caramba, or something belonging to the government. The people called him a hero, and the government got jealous. The president sends for the chief of the Department of Public Edifices. Find me a nice, clean adobe wall, says he, and send Senor Rumpiro up against it. Then call out a file of soldiers, and then let him be up against it. Something, goes on Denver, like the way they've treated Hobson and Carrie Nation in our country. So the general had to flee. But he was thoughtful enough to bring along his roll. He's got sinews of war enough to buy a battleship and float her off in the christening fluid. What chance has he got to be president? Wasn't I just giving you his rating? Says Denver. His country is one of the few in South America where the presidents are elected by popular ballot. The general can't go there just now. It hurts to be shot against a wall. He needs a campaign manager to go down and whoop things up for him, to get the boys in line and the new $2 bills afloat and the babies kissed and the machine in running order. Sully, I don't want to brag, but you remember how I brought Coughlin in under the wire for leader of the 19th? Ours was the Banner District. Don't you suppose I know how to manage a little monkey cage of a country like that? Why, with the dough the general's willing to turn loose, I could put 2 more coats of Japan varnish on him and have him elected governor of Georgia. New York has got the finest lot of campaign managers in the world, Sully, and you give me a feeling of hauteur when you cast doubts on my ability to handle the political situation in a country so small that they have to print the names of the towns in the appendix and footnotes. I argued with Denver some. I told him that politics down in that tropical atmosphere was bound to be different from the 19th District. But I might just as well have been a congressman from North Dakota trying to get an appropriation for a lighthouse and a coast survey. Denver Galloway had ambitions in the manager line, and what I said didn't amount to as much as a fig leaf at the National Dressmakers Convention. I'll give you 3 days to cogitate about going, says Denver, and I'll introduce you to General Rumpiro tomorrow, so you can get his ideas drawn right from the rosewood. I put on my best reception to Booker Washington manner the next day and tapped the distinguished rubber plant for what he knew. General Rumpiro wasn't so gloomy inside as he appeared on the surface. He was polite enough, and he exuded a number of sounds that made a fair stagger at arranging themselves into language. It was English he aimed at, and when his system of syntax reached your mind, it wasn't past you to understand it. If you took a college professor's magazine essay and a Chinese laundryman's explanation of a lost shirt and jumbled them together, you'd have about what the general handed you out for conversation. He told me all about his bleeding country and what they were trying to do for it before the doctor came. But he mostly talked of Denver C. Galloway. Ah, senor, says he, that is the most fine of mans. Never I have seen one man so magnifico, so grand, so conformable to make done things so swiftly by other mans. He shall make other mans do the acts and himself to order and regulate until we arrive at seeing accomplishments of a suddenly. Oh yes, senor. In my country there is not such mans of so bigness, so good talk, so compliments, so strongness of sense and such. Ah, that Senor Galloway. Yes, says I. Old Denver is the boy you want. He's managed every kind of business here except filibustering, and he might as well complete the list. Before the 3 days was up, I decided to join Denver in his campaign. Denver got 3 months' vacation from his hotel owners. For a week we lived in a room with the general and got all the pointers about his country that we could interpret from the noises he made. When we got ready to start, Denver had a pocket full of memorandums and letters from the general to his friends, and a list of names and addresses of loyal politicians who would help along the boom of the exiled popular idol. Besides these liabilities, we carried assets to the amount of $20,000 in assorted United States currency. General Rumpiro looked like a burnt effigy, but he was Brer Fox himself when it came to the real science of politics. Here is moneys, says the general, of a small amount. There is more with me, mucho more. Plenty moneys shall you be supplied, Senor Galloway. More I shall send you at all times that you need. I shall desire to pay 100,000 pesos, if necessario, to be elect. How no? Sacramento. If that I am president and do not make $1,000,000 in the 1 year, you shall kick me on that side. Valgame Dios. Denver got a Cuban cigar maker to fix up a little cipher code with English and Spanish words and gave the general a copy so we could cable him bulletins about the election or for more money. And then we were ready to start. General Rompiro escorted us to the steamer. On the pier, he hugged Denver around the waist and sobbed. "Noble mans," says he, "General Rompiro propels you into his confidence and trust. Go in the hands of the saints to do the work for your friend. Viva la libertad!" "Sure," says Denver. "And viva la liberality and la Soperino and Hotster land of the lotus and the votus. Don't worry, General, we'll have you elected as sure as bananas grow upside down." "Make pictures on me," pleads the General. "Make pictures on me for money as it is needful." "Does he want to be tattooed, would you think?" asks Denver, wrinkling up his eyes. "Stupid," says I. "He wants you to draw on him for election expenses. It'll be worse than tattooing, more like an autopsy." Me and Denver steamed down to Panama, and then hiked across the isthmus, and then by steamer again down to the town of Espiritu on the coast of the General's country. That was a town to send J. Howard Payne to the growler. I'll tell you how you could make one like it. Take a lot of Filipino huts and a couple of hundred brick kilns and arrange them in squares in a cemetery. Cart down all the conservatory plants in the Astor and Vanderbilt greenhouses and stick 'em about wherever there's room. Turn all the Bellevue patients and the Barbers' Convention and the Tuskegee School loose in the streets and run the thermometer up to 120 in the shade. Set a fringe of the Rocky Mountains around the rear, let it rain, and set the whole business on Rockaway Beach in the middle of January, and you'd have a good imitation of Espiritu. It took me and Denver about a week to get acclimated. Denver sent out the letters the General had given him and notified the rest of the gang that there was something doing at the captain's office. We set up headquarters in an old 'dobe house on a side street where the grass was waist high. The election was only 4 weeks off, but there wasn't any excitement. The home candidate for president was named Rodriguez. This town of Espiritu wasn't the capital any more than Cleveland, Ohio is the capital of the United States, but it was the political center where they cooked up revolutions and made up the slates. At the end of the week, Denver says the machine has started running. "Sully," says he, "we've got a walkover. Just because General Rompiro ain't Don Juan on the spot, the other crowd ain't at work. They're as full of apathy as a territorial delegate during the chaplain's prayer. Now, we want to introduce a little hot stuff in the way of campaigning, and we'll surprise 'em at the polls." "How are you going to go about it?" I asks. "Why, the usual way," says Denver, surprised. "We'll get the orators on our side out every night to make speeches in the native lingo, and have torchlight parades under the shade of the palms, and free drinks, and buy up all the brass bands, of course. And, well, I'll turn the baby kissing over to you, Sully. I've seen a lot of 'em." "What else?" says I. "Why, you know," says Denver. "We get the healers out with the crackly two-spots and coal tickets and orders for groceries and have a couple of picnics out under the banyan trees and dances in the fireman's hall, and the usual things. But first of all, Sully, I'm going to have the biggest clam bake down on the beach that was ever seen south of the Tropic of Capricorn. I figured that out from the start. We'll stuff the whole town and the jungle folk for miles around with clams. That's the first thing on the program. Suppose you go out now and make the arrangements for that. I want to look over the estimates the General made of the vote in the coast districts." I had learned some Spanish in Mexico, so I goes out, as Denver says, and in 15 minutes I come back to headquarters. "If there ever was a clam in this country, nobody ever saw it," I says. "Great skyrockets," says Denver with his mouth and eyes open. "No clams? How in the... Whoever saw a country without clams? What kind of a... How's an election to be pulled off without a clam bake, I'd like to know. Are you sure there's no clams, Sully?" "Not even a can," says I. "Then for God's sake go out and try to find what the people here do eat. We've got to fill 'em up with grub of some kind." I went out again. Denver was manager. In half an hour I gets back. "They eat," says I, "tortillas, cassava, carne de chivo, arroz con pollo, aguacates, zapates, yuca, and huevos fritos." "The man that would eat them things," says Denver, getting a little mad, "ought to have his vote challenged." In a few more days, the campaign managers from the other towns came sliding into Espiritu. Our headquarters was a busy place. We had an interpreter and ice water and drinks and cigars, and Denver flashed the general's roll so often that it got so small you couldn't have bought a Republican vote in Ohio with it. And then Denver cabled to General Rampiro for $10,000 more, and got it. There were a number of Americans in Espiritu, but they were all in business or grafts of some kind, and wouldn't take any hand in politics, which was sensible enough. But they showed me and Denver a fine time, and fixed us up so we could get decent things to eat and drink. There was one American named Hicks, used to come and loaf at the headquarters. Hicks had had 14 years of Espiritu. He was 6'4" and weighed in at 135. Cocoa was his line, and coast fever and the climate had taken all the life out of him. They said he hadn't smiled in 8 years. His face was 3 feet long, and it never moved except when he opened it to take quinine. He used to sit in our headquarters and kill fleas and talk sarcastic. "I don't take much interest in politics," says Hicks one day, "but I'd like you to tell me what you're trying to do down here, Galloway." "We're boosting General Rampiro, of course," says Denver. "We're going to put him in the presidential chair. I'm his manager." "Well," says Hicks, "if I was you, I'd be a little slower about it. You've got a long time ahead of you, you know." "Not any longer than I need," says Denver. Denver went ahead and worked things smooth. He dealt out money on the quiet to his lieutenants, and they were always coming after it. There was free drinks for everybody in town, and bands playing every night, and fireworks. And there was a lot of healers going around and buying up votes day and night for the new style of politics in Espiritu. And everybody liked it. The day set for the election was November 4th. On the night before, Denver and me were smoking our pipes in headquarters, and in comes Hicks and unjoints himself and sits in a chair, mournful. Denver is cheerful and confident. "Rampiro will win in a romp," says he. "We'll carry the country by 10,000. It's all over but the Vivas. Tomorrow will tell the tale." "What's going to happen tomorrow?" asks Hicks. "Why, the presidential election, of course," says Denver. "Say," says Hicks, looking kind of funny, "didn't anybody tell you fellows that the election was held a week before you came? Congress changed the date to July 27th. Rodricky's was elected by 17,000. I thought you was booming old Rampiro for next term, 2 years from now. Wondered if you was going to keep up such a hot lick that long." I dropped my pipe on the floor. Denver bit the stem off of his. Neither of us said anything. And then I heard a sound like somebody ripping a clapboard off of a barn roof. 'Twas Hicks, laughing for the first time in 8 years. Sully Magoon paused while the waiter poured us a black coffee. "Your friend was indeed something of a manager," I said. "Wait a minute," said Sully. "I haven't given you any idea of what he could do yet. That's all to come." When we got back to New York, there was General Rampiro waiting for us on the pier. He was dancing like a cinnamon bear, all impatient for the news, for Denver had just cabled him when we would arrive, and nothing more. "Am I elect?" he shouts. "Am I elect, friend of mine? Is that mine country have demand General Rampiro for the president? The last $1 of mine have I sent you that last time. It is necessario that I am elect. I have not more money. Am I elect, Senor Galloway?" Denver turns to me. "Leave me with old Rompy, Sully," he says. "I've got to break it to him gently. 'Twould be indecent for other eyes to witness the operation. This is the time, Sully," says he, "when old Denver has got to make good as a jollier and a silver-tongued sorcerer, or else give up all the medals he's earned." A couple of days later, I went around to the hotel. There was Denver in his old place, looking like the hero of 2 historical novels and telling him what a fine time he'd had down on his orange plantation in Florida. "Did you fix things up with the general?" I asks him. "Did I?" says Denver. "Come and see." He takes me by the arm and walks me to the dining room door. There was a little chocolate-brown fat man in a dress suit with his face shining with joy as he swelled himself and skipped about the floor. Danged if Denver hadn't made General Rampiro head waiter of the Hotel Brunswick. "Is Mr. Galloway still in the managing business?" I asked as Mr. Magoon ceased. Sully shook his head. "Denver married an auburn-haired widow that owns a big hotel in Harlem. He just helps around the place." End of chapter 18. Chapter 19 of Roads of Destiny. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Scott Foster. Roads of Destiny by O. Henry. Chapter 19. Whistling Dick's Christmas Stocking. It was with much caution that Whistling Dick slid back the door of the boxcar, for Article 5716 City Ordinances authorized, perhaps unconstitutionally, arrest on suspicion, and he was familiar of old with this ordinance. So, before climbing out, he surveyed the field with all the care of a good general. He saw no change since his last visit to this big, alms-giving, long-suffering city of the South, the cold-weather paradise of the tramps. The levee where his freight car stood was pimpled with dark bulks of merchandise. The breeze reeked with the well-remembered, sickening smell of the old tarpaulins that covered bales and barrels. The Dun River slipped along, among the shipping with an oily gurgle. Far down toward Chalmette, he could see the great bend in the stream, outlined by the row of electric lights. Across the river, Algiers lay, a long, irregular blot, made darker by the dawn which lightened the sky beyond. An industrious tug or two, coming for some early sailing ship, gave a few appalling toots that seemed to be the signal for breaking day. The Italian luggers were creeping nearer their landing, laden with early vegetables and shellfish. A vague roar, subterranean in quality, from dray wheels and streetcars began to make itself heard and felt. And the ferry boats, the Mary Anns of watercraft, stirred sullenly to their menial morning tasks. Whistling Dick's red head popped suddenly back into the car. A sight too imposing and magnificent for his gaze had been added to the scene. A vast, incomparable policeman rounded a pile of rice sacks and stood within 20 yards of the car. The daily miracle of the dawn, now being performed above Algiers, received the flattering attention of this specimen of municipal official splendor. He gazed with unbiased dignity at the faintly glowing colors until, at last, he turned to them his broad back, as if convinced that legal interference was not needed, and the sunrise might proceed unchecked. So he turned his face to the rice bags, and, drawing a flat flask from an inside pocket, he placed it to his lips and regarded the firmament. Whistling Dick, professional tramp, possessed a half-friendly acquaintance with this officer. They had met several times before on the levee at night, for the officer, himself a lover of music, had been attracted by the exquisite whistling of the shiftless vagabond. Still, he did not care, under the present circumstances, to renew the acquaintance. There is a difference between meeting a policeman on a lonely wharf and whistling a few operatic airs with him, and being caught by him crawling out of a freight car. So Dick waited, as even a New Orleans policeman must move on sometime. Perhaps it is a retributive law of nature, and before long, Big Fritz majestically disappeared between the trains of cars. Whistling Dick waited as long as his judgment advised, and then slid swiftly to the ground. Assuming as far as possible the air of an honest laborer who seeks his daily toil, he moved across the network of railway lines with the intention of making his way by quiet Giraud Street to a certain bench in Lafayette Square, where, according to appointment, he hoped to rejoin a pal known as Slick, this adventurous pilgrim having preceded him by one day in a cattle car into which a loose slat had enticed him. As Whistling Dick picked his way where night still lingered among the big reeking musty warehouses, he gave way to the habit that had won for him his title. Subdued yet clear, with each note as true and liquid as a bobolink's, his whistle tinkled about the dim, cold mountains of brick like drops of rain falling into a hidden pool. He followed an air, but it swam mistily into a swirling current of improvisation. You could call out the trill of mountain brooks, the staccato of green rushes shivering above chilly lagoons, the pipe of sleepy birds. Rounding a corner, the whistler collided with a mountain of blue and brass. "So," observed the mountain calmly, "you're already pack. Und der will not be frost before 2 weeks yet. Und you have forgotten how to whistle. There was a false note in that last bar." "What yer know about it?" said Whistling Dick with tentative familiarity. "You with your little German band nixcommer's tunes. What yer know about music? Pick your ears and listen again. Here's the way I whistled it, see?" He puckered his lips, but the big policeman held up his hand. "Stop," he said, "and learn the right way. And learn also that a rolling stone can't whistle for a cent." Big Fritz's heavy mustache rounded into a circle, and from its depths came a sound deep and mellow as that from a flute. He repeated a few bars of the air the tramp had been whistling. The rendition was cold but correct, and he emphasized the note he had taken exception to. "Dot B is P natural, und not P flat. Beider way, you better be glad I meet you. 1 hour later, und I would have to put you in a gauge to whistle mit der jailbirds. Der orders are to bull all der pums after sunrise." "To which?" "To bull der pums. Everybody without feasible means. 30 days is der price, or $15. "Is that straight, or a game you given me?" "It's der best tip you ever had. I give it to you because I believe you are not so bad as der rest. Und because you can whistle der Freischütz better than I myself can. Don't run against any more policemen around der corners, but go away from town a few days. Goodbye." So Madame Orleans had at last grown weary of the strange and ruffled brood that came yearly to nestle beneath her charitable pinions. After the big policeman had departed, Whistling Dick stood for an irresolute minute, feeling all the outraged indignation of a delinquent tenant who is ordered to vacate his premises. He had pictured to himself a day of dreamful ease when he should have joined his pal. A day of lounging on the wharf, munching the bananas and coconuts scattered in unloading the fruit steamers. And then a feast along the free lunch counters from which the easy-going owners were too good-natured or too generous to drive him away. And afterward a pipe in one of the little flowery parks and a snooze in some shady corner of the wharf. But here was a stern order to exile, and one that he knew must be obeyed. So, with a wary eye open for the gleam of brass buttons, he began his retreat toward a rural refuge. A few days in the country need not necessarily prove disastrous. Beyond the possibility of a slight nip of frost, there was no formidable evil to be looked for. However, it was with a depressed spirit that Whistling Dick passed the old French market on his chosen route down the river. For safety's sake, he still presented to the world his portrayal of the part of the worthy artisan on his way to labor. A stall-keeper in the market, undeceived, hailed him by the generic name of his ilk, and Jack halted, taken by surprise. The vendor, melted by this proof of his own acuteness, bestowed a foot of frankfurter and half a loaf, and thus the problem of breakfast was solved. When the streets, from topographical reasons, began to shun the river bank, the exile mounted to the top of the levee, and on its well-trodden path pursued his way. The suburban eye regarded him with cold suspicion. Individuals reflected the stern spirit of the city's heartless edict. He missed the seclusion of the crowded town and the safety he could always find in the multitude. At Chalmette, 6 miles upon his desultory way, there suddenly menaced him a vast and bewildering industry. A new port was being established. The dock was being built, compresses were going up. Picks and shovels and barrows struck at him like serpents from every side. An arrogant foreman bore down upon him, estimating his muscles with the eye of a recruiting sergeant. Brown men and black men all about him were toiling away. He fled in terror. By noon he had reached the country of the plantations, the great, sad, silent levels bordering the mighty river. He overlooked fields of sugar cane so vast that their farthest limits melted into the sky. The sugar-making season was well advanced, and the cutters were at work. The wagons creaked drearily after them. The Negro teamsters inspired the mules to greater speed with mellow and sonorous imprecations. Dark green groves, blurred by the blue of distance, showed where the plantation houses stood. The tall chimneys of the sugar mills caught the eye miles distant, like lighthouses at sea. At a certain point, Whistling Dick's unerring nose caught the scent of frying fish. Like a pointer to a quail, he made his way down the levee side straight to the camp of a credulous and ancient fisherman, whom he charmed with song and story so that he dined like an admiral, and then, like a philosopher, annihilated the worst 3 hours of the day by a nap under the trees. When he awoke and again continued his hegira, a frosty sparkle in the air had succeeded the drowsy warmth of the day, and as this portent of a chilly night translated itself to the brain of Sir Peregrine, he lengthened his stride and bethought him of shelter. He traveled a road that faithfully followed the convolutions of the levee, running along its base, but whither he knew not. Bushes and rank grass crowded it to the wheel ruts, and out of this ambuscade the pests of the lowlands swarmed after him, humming a keen, vicious soprano. As the night grew nearer, although colder, the whine of the mosquitoes became a greedy, petulant snarl that shut out all other sounds. To his right, against the heavens, he saw a green light moving, and accompanying it the masts and funnels of a big incoming steamer, moving as upon a screen at a magic lantern show. And there were mysterious marshes at his left, out of which came queer gurgling cries and a choked croaking. The whistling vagrant struck up a merry warble to offset these melancholy influences, and it is likely that never before, since Pan himself jigged it on his reeds, had such sounds been heard in those depressing solitudes. A distant clatter in the rear quickly developed into the swift beat of horses' hoofs, and Whistling Dick stepped aside into the dew-wet grass to clear the track. Turning his head, he saw approaching a fine team of stylish greys drawing a double surrey. A stout man with a white mustache occupied the front seat, giving all his attention to the rigid lines in his hands. Behind him sat a placid, middle-aged lady and a brilliant-looking girl hardly arrived at young ladyhood. The lap-robe had slipped partly from the knees of the gentleman driving, and Whistling Dick saw 2 stout canvas bags between his feet. Bags such as, while loafing in cities, he had seen warily transferred between express wagons and bank doors. The remaining space in the vehicle was filled with parcels of various sizes and shapes. As the surrey swept even with the sidetracked tramp, the bright-eyed girl, seized by some merry madcap impulse, leaned out toward him with a sweet, dazzling smile and cried, "Merry Christmas!" in a shrill, plaintive treble. Such a thing had not often happened to Whistling Dick, and he felt handicapped in devising the correct response. But, lacking time for reflection, he let his instinct decide, and, snatching off his battered derby, he rapidly extended it at arm's length and drew it back with a continuous motion, and shouted a loud but ceremonious, "Ah, there!" after the flying surrey. The sudden movement of the girl had caused one of the parcels to become unwrapped, and something limp and black fell from it into the road. The tramp picked it up and found it to be a new black silk stocking, long and fine and slender. It crunched crisply and yet with a luxurious softness between his fingers. "They're bloomin' little skeezicks," said Whistling Dick with a broad grin bisecting his freckled face. "What do yer think of that, now? Merry Christmas. Sounded like a cuckoo clock, that's what she did. Dem guys is swells, too, bet your life, and der old un stacks dem sacks of dough down under his trotters like dey was common as dried apples. Been shopping for Christmas, and de kid's lost one of her new socks, what she was goin' to hold up Santy wid. De bloomin' little skeezicks, wid her Merry Christmas. What do yer think? Same as to say, 'Hello, Jack, how goes it?' And as swell as Fifth Avenue, and as easy as a blowout in Cincinnati." Whistling Dick folded the stocking carefully and stuffed it into his pocket. It was nearly 2 hours later when he came upon signs of habitation. The buildings of an extensive plantation were brought into view by a turn in the road. He easily selected the planter's residence in a large square building with 2 wings, with numerous good-sized, well-lighted windows, and broad verandas running around its full extent. It was set upon a smooth lawn, which was faintly lit by the far-reaching rays of the lamps within. A noble grove surrounded it, and old-fashioned shrubbery grew thickly about the walks and fences. The quarters of the hands and the mill buildings were situated at a distance in the rear. The road was now enclosed on each side by a fence, and presently, as Whistling Dick drew nearer the house, he suddenly stopped and sniffed the air. "If dere ain't a hobo stew cookin' somewhere in dis immediate precinct," he said to himself, "me nose has quit tellin' de trut." Without hesitation, he climbed the fence to windward. He found himself in an apparently disused lot, where piles of old bricks were stacked, and rejected, decaying lumber. In a corner he saw the faint glow of a fire that had become little more than a bed of living coals, and he thought he could see some dim human forms sitting or lying about it. He drew nearer, and by the light of a little blaze that suddenly flared up, he saw plainly the fat figure of a ragged man in an old brown sweater and cap. "Dat man," said Whistling Dick to himself softly, "is a dead ringer for Boston Harry. I'll try him with de high sign." He whistled 1 or 2 bars of a ragtime melody, and the air was immediately taken up, and then quickly ended with a peculiar run. The first whistler walked confidently up to the fire. The fat man looked up and spake in a loud asthmatic wheeze. "Gents, the unexpected but welcome addition to our circle is Mr. Whistling Dick, an old friend of mine for whom I fully vouches. The waiter will lay another cover at once. Mr. W.D. will join us at supper, during which function he will enlighten us in regard to the circumstances that gave us the pleasure of his company." "Chewin' de stuffin' out'n de dictionary as usual, Boston," said Whistling Dick, "but thanks all de same for de invitation. I guess I finds myself here about de same way as yous guys. A cop gimme de tip this mornin'. Yous workin' on dis farm?" "A guest," said Boston sternly, "shouldn't never insult his entertainers until he's filled up wid grub. 'Tain't good business sense. Workin'! But I will restrain myself. We five, me, Deaf Pete, Blinky, Goggles, and Indiana Tom, got put on to this scheme of New Orleans to work visiting gentlemen upon her dirty streets, and we hit the road last evening just as the tender hues of twilight had flopped down upon the daisies and things. Blinky, pass the empty oyster can at your left to the empty gentleman at your right." For the next 10 minutes, the gang of roadsters paid their undivided attention to the supper. In an old 5-gallon kerosene can, they had cooked a stew of potatoes, meat, and onions, which they partook of from smaller cans they had found scattered about the vacant lot. Whistling Dick had known Boston Harry of old, and knew him to be one of the shrewdest and most successful of his brotherhood. He looked like a prosperous stock drover, or solid merchant from some country village. He was stout and hale, with a ruddy, always smoothly shaven face. His clothes were strong and neat, and he gave special attention to his decent-appearing shoes. During the past 10 years he had acquired a reputation for working a larger number of successfully managed confidence games than any of his acquaintances, and he had not a day's work to be counted against him. It was rumored among his associates that he had saved a considerable amount of money. The 4 other men were fair specimens of the slinking, ill-clad, noisome genus who carried their labels of suspicious in plain view. After the bottom of the large can had been scraped and pipes lit at the coals, 2 of the men called Boston aside and spake with him lowly and mysteriously. He nodded decisively, and then said aloud to Whistling Dick, "Listen, sonny, to some plain talky-talk. We 5 are on a lay. I've guaranteed you to be square, and you're to come in on the profits equal with the boys, and you've got to help. 200 hands on this plantation are expecting to be paid a week's wages tomorrow morning. Tomorrow's Christmas, and they want to lay off. Says the boss, work from 5 to 9 in the morning to get a train load of sugar off, and I'll pay every man cash down for the week and a day extra. They say, 'Hooray for the boss, it goes.' He drives to New Orleans today and fetches back the cold dollars. $2,074.50 is the amount. I got the figures from a man who talks too much, who got 'em from the bookkeeper. The boss of this plantation thinks he's going to pay this wealth to the hands. He's got it down wrong. He's going to pay it to us. It's going to stay in the leisure class where it belongs. Now half of this haul goes to me, and the other half the rest of you may divide. Why the difference? I represent the brains. It's my scheme. Here's the way we're going to get it. There's some company at supper in the house, but they'll leave about 9. They've just happened in for an hour or so. If they don't go pretty soon, we'll work the scheme anyhow. We want all night to get away good with the dollars. They're heavy. About 9 o'clock, Deaf Pete and Blinky'll go down the road about a quarter beyond the house and set fire to a big cane field there that the cutters haven't touched yet. The wind's just right to have it roaring in 2 minutes. The alarm will be given, and every man jack about the place will be down there in 10 minutes, fighting fire. That'll leave the money sacks and the women alone in the house for us to handle. You've heard cane burn? Well, there's mighty few women can screech loud enough to be heard above its crackling. The thing's dead safe. The only danger is in being caught before we can get far enough away with the money. Now, if you—" "Boston," interrupted Whistling Dick, rising to his feet, "thanks for all the grub yous fellers has given me, but I'll be moving on now." "What do you mean?" asked Boston, also rising. "Why, you can count me out of dis deal. You oughter know that. I'm on de bum all right enough, but that other ting don't go with me. Burglary is no good. I'll say good night and many thanks for—" Whistling Dick had moved away a few steps as he spoke, but he stopped very suddenly. Boston had covered him with a short revolver of roomy caliber. "Take your seat," said the tramp leader. "I'd feel mighty proud of myself if I let you go and spoil the game. You'll stick right in this camp until we finish the job. The end of that brick pile is your limit. You go 2 inches beyond that and I'll have to shoot. Better take it easy now." "It's my way of doing," said Whistling Dick. "Easy goes. You can depress the muzzle of dat 12-incher and run her back on the trucks. I remains, as the newspapers says, in your midst." "All right," said Boston, lowering his piece, as the other returned and took his seat again on a projecting plank in a pile of timber. "Don't try to leave, that's all. I wouldn't miss this chance even if I had to shoot an old acquaintance to make it go. I don't want to hurt anybody specially, but this $1,000 I'm going to get will fix me for fair. I'm going to drop the road and start a saloon in a little town I know about. I'm tired of being kicked around." Boston Harry took from his pocket a cheap silver watch and held it near the fire. "It's 8:45, he said. "Pete, you and Blinky start. Go down the road past the house and fire the cane in a dozen places. Then strike for the levee and come back on it instead of the road so you won't meet anybody. By the time you get back, the men will all be striking out for the fire and will break for the house and collar the dollars. Everybody cough up what matches he's got." The two surly tramps made a collection of all the matches in the party, Whistling Dick contributing his quota with propitiatory alacrity, and then they departed in the dim starlight in the direction of the road. Of the 3 remaining vagrants, 2, Goggles and Indiana Tom, reclined lazily upon convenient lumber and regarded Whistling Dick with an undisguised disfavor. Boston, observing that the dissenting recruit was disposed to remain peaceably, relaxed a little of his vigilance. Whistling Dick arose presently and strolled leisurely up and down, keeping carefully within the territory assigned him. "Dis planter chap," he said, pausing before Boston Harry. "What makes yer tink he's got the tin in de house wid him?" "I am advised of all the facts in the case," said Boston. "He drove to New Orleans and got it, I say, today. Want to change your mind now and come in?" "Nah, I was just asking. What kind of team did the boss drive?" "Pair of grays." "Double Surrey?" "Yep." "Women folks along?" "Wife and kid. Say, what morning paper are you trying to pump news for?" "I was just conversing to pass the time away. I guess that team passed me in the road this evening, that's all." As Whistling Dick put his hands in his pockets and continued his curtailed beat up and down by the fire, he felt the silk stocking he had picked up in the road. "They're bloomin' little skeezicks," he muttered with a grin. As he walked up and down, he could see, through a sort of natural opening or lane among the trees, the planter's residence some 75 yards distant. The side of the house toward him exhibited spacious, well-lighted windows through which a soft radiance streamed, illuminating the broad veranda and some extent of the lawn beneath. "What's that you said?" asked Boston sharply. "Oh, nothin' at all," said Whistling Dick, lounging carelessly and kicking meditatively at a little stone on the ground. "Just as easy," continued the warbling vagrant softly to himself, "and sociable and swell and sassy wid her Merry Christmas. What do yer think now?" Dinner, 2 hours late, was being served in the Belmead Plantation dining room. The dining room and all its appurtenances spoke of an old regime that was here continued rather than suggested to the memory. The plate was rich to the extent that its age and quaintness alone saved it from being showy. There were interesting names signed in the corners of the pictures on the walls. The viands were of the kind that bring a shine into the eyes of gourmets. The service was swift, silent, lavish, as in the days when the waiters were assets like the plate. The names by which the planter's family and their visitors addressed one another were historic in the annals of 2 nations. Their manners and conversation had that most difficult kind of ease, the kind that still preserves punctilio. The planter himself seemed to be the dynamo that generated the larger portion of the gaiety and wit. The younger ones at the board found it more than difficult to turn back on him his guns of raillery and banter. It is true, the young men attempted to storm his works repeatedly, incited by the hope of gaining the approbation of their fair companions. But even when they sped a well-aimed shaft, the planter forced them to feel defeat by the tremendous discomfiting thunder of the laughter with which he accompanied his retorts. At the head of the table, serene, matronly, benevolent, reigned the mistress of the house, placing here and there the right smile, the right word, the encouraging glance. The talk of the party was too desultory, too evanescent to follow, but at last they came to the subject of the tramp nuisance, one that had of late vexed the plantations for many miles around. The planter seized the occasion to direct his good-natured fire of raillery at the mistress, accusing her of encouraging the plague. "They swarm up and down the river every winter," he said. "They overrun New Orleans, and we catch the surplus, which is generally the worst part. And a day or two ago, Madame New Orleans, suddenly discovering that she can't go shopping without brushing her skirts against great rows of the vagabonds sunning themselves on the banquettes, says to the police, 'Catch 'em all,' and the police catch a dozen or two, and the remaining 3,000 or 4,000 overflow up and down the levee. And Madame there," pointing tragically with the carving knife at her, "feeds them. They won't work. They defy my overseers, and they make friends with my dogs. And you, Madame, feed them before my eyes, and intimidate me when I would interfere. Tell us, please, how many today did you thus incite to future laziness and depredation?" "6, I think," said Madame, with a reflective smile. "But you know 2 of them offered to work, for you heard them yourself." The planter's disconcerting laugh rang out again. "Yes, at their own trades, and one was an artificial flower maker, and the other a glass blower. Oh, they were looking for work. Not a hand would they consent to lift to labor of any other kind. And another one," continued the soft-hearted mistress, "used quite good language. It was really extraordinary for one of his class. And he carried a watch, and had lived in Boston. I don't believe they are all bad. They have always seemed to me to rather lack development. I always look upon them as children with whom wisdom has remained at a standstill while whiskers have continued to grow. We passed one this evening as we were driving home who had a face as good as it was incompetent. He was whistling the intermezzo from Cavalleria and blowing the spirit of Mascagni himself into it." A bright-eyed young girl who sat at the left of the mistress leaned over and said in a confidential undertone, "I wonder, Mamma, if that tramp we passed on the road found my stocking, and do you think he will hang it up tonight? Now I can hang up but one. Do you know why I wanted a new pair of silk stockings when I have plenty? Well, old Aunt Judy says if you hang up 2 that have never been worn, Santa Claus will fill one with good things, and Monsieur Pam will place in the other payment for all the words you have spoken, good or bad, on the day before Christmas. That's why I've been unusually nice and polite to everyone today. Monsieur Pam, you know, is a witch gentleman. He—" The words of the young girl were interrupted by a startling thing. Like the wraith of some burned-out shooting star, a black streak came crashing through the window-pane and upon the table, where it shivered into fragments a dozen pieces of crystal and chinaware, and then glanced between the heads of the guests to the wall, imprinting therein a deep, round indentation, at which today the visitor to Belmead marvels, as he gazes upon it and listens to this tale as it is told. The women screamed in many keys, and the men sprang to their feet, and would have laid their hands upon their swords had not the verities of chronology forbidden. The planter was the first to act. He sprang to the intruding missile and held it up to view. "By Jupiter!" he cried, "a meteoric shower of hosiery! Has communication at last been established with Mars?" "I should say, Venus," ventured a young gentleman visitor, looking hopefully for approbation toward the unresponsive young lady visitors. The planter held at arm's length the unceremonious visitor, a long dangling black stocking. "It's loaded," he announced. As he spoke, he reversed the stocking, holding it by the toe, and down from it dropped a roundish stone, wrapped about by a piece of yellowish paper. "Now for the first interstellar message of the century," he cried, and, nodding to the company who had crowded about him, he adjusted his glasses with provoking deliberation, and examined it closely. When he finished, he had changed from the jolly host to the practical, decisive man of business. He immediately struck a bell, and said to the silent-footed mulatto man who responded, "Go and tell Mr. Wesley to get Reeves and Maurice and about 10 stout hands they can rely upon, and come to the hall door at once. Tell him to have the men arm themselves and bring plenty of ropes and plough lines. Tell him to hurry." And then he read aloud from the paper these words: "To the gent of the house. There is 5 tough hobos except meself in the vacant lot near de road where de old brick piles is. They got me stuck up with a gun, see, and I taken dis means of communication. Two of der lads is gone down to set fire to de cane field below de house, and when yous fellers goes to turn de hose on it, de whole gang is going to rob de house of de money you got to pay off wit. Say get a move on. You say de kid dropped dis sock in de road. Tell her Merry Christmas, de same as she told me. Catch de bums down the road first, and then send a relief corps to get me out of soak. Yours truly, Whistlin' Dick. There was some quiet but rapid maneuvering at Belmead during the ensuing half hour, which ended in 5 disgusted and sullen tramps being captured and locked securely in an outhouse pending the coming of the morning and retribution. For another result, the visiting young gentlemen had secured the unqualified worship of the visiting young ladies by their distinguished and heroic conduct. For still another, behold Whistling Dick, the hero, seated at the planter's table, feasting upon viands his experience had never before included, and waited upon by admiring femininity in shapes of such beauty and swellness that even his ever-full mouth could scarcely prevent him from whistling. He was made to disclose in detail his adventure with the evil gang of Boston Harry, and how he cunningly wrote the note and wrapped it around the stone and placed it at the toe of the stocking, and, watching his chance, sent it silently with a wonderful centrifugal momentum like a comet at one of the big lighted windows of the dining room. The planter vowed that the wanderer should wander no more, that his was a goodness and an honesty that should be rewarded, and that a debt of gratitude had been made that must be paid, for had he not saved them from a doubtless imminent loss and maybe a greater calamity? He assured Whistling Dick that he might consider himself a charge upon the honour of Belmead, that a position suited to his powers would be found for him at once, and hinted that the way would be heartily smoothed for him to rise to as high places of emolument and trust as the plantation afforded. But now, they said, he must be weary, and the immediate thing to consider was rest and sleep. So the mistress spoke to a servant, and Whistling Dick was conducted to a room in the wing of the house occupied by the servants. To this room, in a few minutes, was brought a portable tin bathtub filled with water, which was placed on a piece of oiled cloth upon the floor. There the vagrant was left to pass the night. By the light of a candle he examined the room. A bed, with the covers neatly turned back, revealed snowy pillows and sheets. A worn but clean red carpet covered the floor. There was a dresser with a beveled mirror, a washstand with a flowered bowl and pitcher. The 2 or 3 chairs were softly upholstered. A little table held books, papers, and a day-old cluster of roses in a jar. There were towels on a rack and soap in a white dish. Whistling Dick set his candle on a chair and placed his hat carefully under the table. After satisfying what we must suppose to have been his curiosity by a sober scrutiny, he removed his coat, folded it, and laid it upon the floor near the wall, as far as possible from the unused bathtub. Taking his coat for a pillow, he stretched himself luxuriously upon the carpet. When, on Christmas morning, the first streaks of dawn broke above the marshes, Whistling Dick awoke and reached instinctively for his hat. Then he remembered that the skirts of fortune had swept him into their folds on the night previous, and he went to the window and raised it to let the fresh breath of the morning cool his brow and fix the yet dreamlike memory of his good luck within his brain. As he stood there, certain dread and ominous sounds pierced the fearful hollow of his ear. The force of plantation workers, eager to complete the shortened task allotted to them, were all astir. The mighty din of the ogre Labor shook the earth, and the poor tattered and forever disguised prince in search of his fortune held tight to the window-sill even in the enchanted castle, and trembled. Already from the bosom of the mill came the thunder of rolling barrels of sugar, and, prison-like sounds. There was a great rattling of chains, as the mules were harried with stimulant imprecations to their places by the wagon tongues. A little vicious dummy engine with a train of flat cars in tow stewed and fumed on the plantation tap of the narrow-gauge railroad, and a toiling, hurrying, hallooing stream of workers were dimly seen in the half-darkness, loading the train with the weekly output of sugar. Here was a poem, an epic, nay, a tragedy, with work, the curse of the world, for its theme. The December air was frosty, but the sweat broke out upon Whistling Dick's face. He thrust his head out of the window and looked down. 15 feet below him against the wall of the house, he could make out that a border of flowers grew, and by that token he overhung a bed of soft earth. Softly as a burglar goes, he clambered out upon the sill, lowered himself until he hung by his hands alone, and then dropped safely. No one seemed to be about upon this side of the house. He dodged low and skimmed swiftly across the yard to the low fence. It was an easy matter to vault this, for a terror urged him such as lifts the gazelle over the thorn bush when the lion pursues. A crash through the dew-drenched weeds on the roadside, a clutching, slippery rush up the grassy side of the levee to the footpath at the summit, and he was free. The east was blushing and brightening. The wind, himself a vagrant rover, saluted his brother upon the cheek. Some wild geese high above gave a cry. A rabbit skipped along the path before him, free to turn to the right or to the left as his mood should send him. The river slid past, and certainly no one could tell the ultimate abiding place of its waters. A small, ruffled, brown-breasted bird sitting upon a dogwood sapling began a soft, throaty, tender little piping in praise of the dew which entices foolish worms from their holes. But suddenly he stopped and sat with his head turned sidewise, listening. From the path along the levee there burst forth a jubilant, stirring, buoyant, thrilling whistle, loud and keen and clear as the cleanest notes of the piccolo. The soaring sound rippled and trilled and arpeggioed as the songs of wild birds do not. But it had a wild, free grace that, in a way, reminded the small brown bird of something familiar, but exactly what he could not tell. There was in it the bird call, or reveille, that all birds know, but a great waste of lavish, unmeaning things that art had added and arranged besides, and that were quite puzzling and strange. And the little brown bird sat with his head on one side until the sound died away in the distance. The little bird did not know that the part of that strange warbling that he understood was just what kept the warbler without his breakfast. But he knew very well that the part he did not understand did not concern him, so he gave a little flutter of his wings and swooped down like a brown bullet upon a big fat worm that was wriggling along the levee path. End of chapter 19. Chapter 20 of Roads of Destiny. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Scott Foster. Roads of Destiny by O. Henry, Chapter 21. The Halberdier of the Little RHEINSCHLOSS. I go sometimes into the beer hall and restaurant called Old Munich. Not long ago it was a resort of interesting bohemians, but now only artists and musicians and literary folk frequent it. But the Pilsner is yet good, and I take some diversion from the conversation of waiter number 18. For many years the customers of Old Munich have accepted the place as a faithful copy from the ancient German town. The big hall, with its smoky rafters, rows of imported steins, portrait of Goethe, and verses painted on the walls, translated into German from the original of the Cincinnati poets, seems atmospherically correct when viewed through the bottom of a glass. But not long ago the proprietors added the room above, called it the Little RHEINSCHLOSS, and built in a stairway. Up there was an imitation stone parapet, ivy-covered, and the walls were painted to represent depth and distance, with the Rhine winding at the base of the vineyarded slopes and the castle of Ehrenbreitstein looming directly opposite the entrance. Of course, there were tables and chairs, and you could have beer and food brought to you, as you naturally would on the top of a castle on the Rhine. I went into Old Munich one afternoon when there were few customers and sat at my usual table near the stairway. I was shocked and almost displeased to perceive that the glass cigar case by the orchestra stand had been smashed to smithereens. I did not like things to happen in Old Munich. Nothing had ever happened there before. Waiter number 18 came and breathed on my neck. It was his by right of discovery. 18's brain was built like a corral. It was full of ideas which, when he opened the gate, came huddling out like a flock of sheep that might get together afterward or might not. I did not shine as a shepherd. As a type, 18 fitted nowhere. I did not find out if he had a nationality, family, creed, grievance, hobby, soul, preference, home, or vote. He only came always to my table, and as long as his leisure would permit, let words flutter from him like swallows leaving a barn at daylight. "How did the cigar case come to be broken, 18?" I asked, with a certain feeling of personal grievance. "I can tell you about that, sir," said he, resting his foot on the chair next to mine. "Did you ever have anybody hand you a double handful of good luck while both your hands was full of bad luck and stop to notice how your fingers behaved?" "No riddles, 18, said I. "Leave out palmistry and manicuring." "You remember," said 18, "the guy in the hammered brass Prince Albert and the oroid gold pants and the amalgamated copper hat that carried the combination meat axe, ice pick, and liberty pole and used to stand on the first landing as you go up to the little RHEINSCHLOSS?" "Why, yes," said I, "the halberdier. I never noticed him particularly. I remember he thought he was only a suit of armor. He had a perfect poise." "Well, he had more than that," said 18. "He was me friend. He was an advertisement. The boss hired him to stand on the stairs for a kind of scenery to show there was something doing in the has-been line upstairs. What did you call him? What kind of beer?" "A halberdier," said I. "That was an ancient man-at-arms of many 100 years ago." "Some mistake," said 18. "This one wasn't that old. He wasn't over 23 or 4. It was the boss's idea, rigging a man up in an antebellum suit of tin ware and standing him on the landing of the slosh. He bought the goods at a 4th Avenue antique store and hung a sign out. Able-bodied halberdier wanted. Costume furnished. The same morning, a young man with wrecked good clothes and a hungry look comes in, bringing the sign with him. I was filling the mustard pots at my station. 'I'm it,' says he, 'whatever it is, but I never halberdiered in a restaurant. Put me on. Is it a masquerade?' 'I hear talk in the kitchen of a fish ball,' says I. 'Bully for you, 18, says he. 'You and I'll get on. Show me the boss's desk.' Well, the boss tries the Harveyized pajamas on him, and they fitted him like the scales on a baked red snapper, and he gets the job. You've seen what it is. He stood straight up in the corner of the first landing with his halberd to his shoulder, looking right ahead and guarding the Portugals of the castle. The boss is nutty about having the true old-world flavor to his joint. 'Halberdiers goes with Rheinschlosses,' says he, 'just as rats go with rathskellers and white cotton stockings with Tyrolean villages.' The boss is a kind of antiologist and is all posted up on data and such information. From 8 p.m. to 2 in the morning was the halberdier's hours. He got 2 meals with us help and $1 a night. I eat with him at the table. He liked me. He never told his name. He was traveling impromptu, like kings, I guess. The first time at supper, I says to him, 'Have some more of the spuds, Mr. Frelinghuysen.' 'Oh, don't be so formal and offish, 18, says he. 'Call me Hal. That's short for halberdier.' 'Oh, don't think I wanted to pry for names,' says I. 'I know all about the dizzy fall from wealth and greatness. We've got a count washing dishes in the kitchen, and the third bartender used to be a Pullman conductor, and they work, Sir Percival,' says I, sarcastic. 18, says he, 'as a friendly devil in a cabbage-scented hell, would you mind cutting up this piece of steak for me? I don't say that it's got more muscle than I have, but—' And then he shows me the insides of his hands. They was blistered and cut and corned and swelled up till they looked like a couple of flank steaks crisscrossed with a knife. The kind the butchers hide and take home knowing what is the best. 'Shoveling coal,' says he, 'and piling bricks and loading drays, but they gave out and I had to resign. I was born for a halberdier, and I've been educated for 24 years to fill the position. Now quit knocking my profession and pass along a lot more of that ham. I'm holding the closing exercises,' says he, 'of a 48-hour fast.' The second night he was on the job, he walks down from his corner to the cigar case and calls for cigarettes. The customers at the tables all snicker out loud to show their acquaintance with history. The boss is on. 'And let's see, oh yes, an anachronism,' says the boss. 'Cigarettes was not made at the time when halberdiers was invented.' 'The ones you sell was,' says Percival. 'Caporal wins from chronology by the length of a cork tip.' So he gets 'em and lights one and puts the box in his brass helmet and goes back to patrolling the RHEINSCHLOSS. He made a big hit, especially with the ladies. Some of 'em would poke him with their fingers to see if he was real or only a kind of a stuffed figure, like they burn an elegy. And when he'd move, they'd squeak and make eyes at him as they went up to the slosh. He looked fine in his halberdashery. He slept at $2 a week in a hall room on 3rd Avenue. He invited me up there one night. He had a little book on the washstand that he read instead of shopping in the saloons after hours. 'I'm onto that,' says I, 'from reading about it in novels. All the heroes on the bum carry the little book. It's either Tantalus or Liver or Horace, and it's printed in Latin, and you're a college man. And I wouldn't be surprised, says I, if you wasn't educated too. But it was only the batting averages of the league for the last 10 years. One night about 11:30, there comes in a party of these high rollers that are always hunting up new places to eat in and poke fun at. There was a swell girl in a 40 HP auto tan coat and veil, and a fat old man with white side whiskers, and a young chap that couldn't keep his feet off the tail of the girl's coat, and an oldish lady that looked upon life as immoral and unnecessary. How perfectly delightful, they says, to sup in a slosh. Up the stairs they go, and in half a minute back down comes the girl, her skirts swishing like the waves on the beach. She stops on the landing and looks our halberdier in the eye. "You," she says, with a smile that reminded me of lemon sherbet. "I was waiting upstairs in the slosh then, and I was right down here by the door, putting some vinegar and cayenne into an empty bottle of Tabasco, and I heard all they said." "It," says Percival, without moving. "I'm only local color. Are my hauberk, helmet, and halberd on straight?" "Is there an explanation to this?" says she. "Is it a practical joke, such as men play in those griddle cake and lamb clubs? I'm afraid I don't see the point. I heard, vaguely, that you were away. For 3 months we have not seen you or heard from you." "I'm halberdiering for my living," says the statue. "I'm working," says he. "I don't suppose you know what work means." Have you lost your money?" she asks. Sir Percival studies a minute. "I am poorer," says he, "than the poorest sandwich man on the streets, if I don't earn my living." "You call this work?" says she. "I thought a man worked with his hands or his head instead of becoming a mountebank." "The calling of a halberdier," says he, "is an ancient and honorable one. Sometimes," says he, "the man-at-arms at the door has saved the castle while the plumed knights were cake-walking in the banquet halls above." "I see you're not ashamed," says she, "of your particular tastes. I wonder, though, that the manhood I used to think I saw in you didn't prompt you to draw water or hew wood instead of publicly flaunting your ignominy in this disgraceful masquerade." Sir Percival kind of rattles in his armor and says, "Helen, will you suspend sentence in this matter for just a little while? You don't understand," says he. "I've got to hold this job down a little longer." "You like being a harlequin, or halberdier as you call it?" says she. "I wouldn't get thrown out of the job just now," says he with a grin, "to be appointed minister to the court of St. James's." And then the 40 HP girl's eyes sparkled as hard as diamonds. "Very well," says she, "you shall have full run of your serving man's tastes this night." And she swims over to the boss's desk and gives him a smile that knocks the specks off his nose. "I think your RHEINSCHLOSS," says she, "is as beautiful as a dream. It is a little slice of the old world set down in New York. We shall have a nice supper up there, but if you will grant us one favor, the illusion will be perfect. Give us your halberdier to wait on our table." That hits the boss's antiology hobby just right. "Sure," says he, "dot will be fine. Und der orchestra shall play Die Wacht am Rhein all der time." And he goes over and tells the halberdier to go upstairs and hustle the grub at the swells' table. "I'm on the job," says Sir Percival, taking off his helmet and hanging it on his halberd and leaning him in the corner. The girl goes up and takes her seat, and I see her jaw squared tight under her smile. "We're going to be waited on by a real halberdier," says she, "one who is proud of his profession. Isn't it sweet?" "Ripping," says the swell young man. "Much prefer a waiter," says the fat old gent. "I hope he doesn't come from a cheap museum," says the old lady. "He might have microbes in his costume." Before he goes to the table, Sir Percival takes me by the arm. 18, he says. "I've got to pull off this job without a blunder. You coach me straight or I'll take that halberd and make hash out of you." And then he goes up to the table with his coat of mail on and a napkin over his arm and waits for the order. "Why, it's Deering," says the young swell. "Hello, old man. What the—" "Beg pardon, sir," interrupts the halberdier. "I'm waiting on the table." The old man looks at him grim like a Boston bull. "So, Deering," he says, "you're at work yet?" "Yes, sir," says Percival, quiet and gentlemanly as I could have been myself. "For almost 3 months now." "You haven't been discharged during the time?" asks the old man. "Not once, sir," says he, "though I've had to change my work several times." "Waiter," orders the girl, short and sharp, "another napkin." He brings her one, respectful. I never saw more devil, if I may say it, stirred up in a lady. There was 2 bright red spots on her cheek, and her eyes looked exactly like a wildcat's I'd seen in the zoo. Her foot kept slapping the floor all the time. "Waiter," she orders, "bring me filtered water without ice. Bring me a footstool. Take away this empty salt cellar." She kept him on the jump. She was sure giving the halberdier his. There wasn't but a few customers up in the slosh at that time, so I hung out near the door so I could help Sir Percival serve. He got along fine with the olives and celery and the blue points. They was easy. And then the consommé came up the dumb waiter all in one big silver tureen. Instead of serving it from the side table, he picks it up between his hands and starts to the dining table with it. When nearly there, he drops the tureen smash on the floor, and the soup soaks all the lower part of that girl's swell silk dress. "Stupid, incompetent," says she, giving him a look. "Standing in a corner with a halberd seems to be your mission in life." "Pardon me, lady," says he. "It was just a little bit hotter than blazes. I couldn't help it." The old man pulls out a memorandum book and hunts in it. "The 25th of April, Deering," says he. "I know it," says Sir Percival. "And 10 minutes to 12 o'clock, says the old man. "By Jupiter, you haven't won yet." And he pounds the table with his fist and yells to me, "Waiter, call the manager at once. Tell him to hurry here as fast as he can." I go after the boss, and old Brockman hikes up to the slosh on the jump. "I want this man discharged at once," roars the old guy. "Look what he's done. Ruined my daughter's dress. It cost at least $600. Discharge this awkward lout at once, or I'll sue you for the price of it." "This is bad business," says the boss. $600 is much. I reckon I will have to—" "Wait a minute, Herr Brockman," says Percival, easy and smiling. But he was worked up under his tin suitings. I could see that. And then he made the finest, neatest little speech I ever listened to. I can't give you the words, of course. He give the millionaires a lovely roast in a sarcastic way, describing their automobiles and opera boxes and diamonds, and then he got around to the working classes and the kind of grub they eat and the long hours they work and all that sort of stuff. Bunkum, of course. "The restless rich," says he, "never content with their luxuries, always prowling among the haunts of the poor and humble, amusing themselves with the imperfections and misfortunes of their fellow men and women. And even here, Herr Brockman," he says, "in this beautiful RHEINSCHLOSS, a grand and enlightening reproduction of old-world history and architecture, they come to disturb its symmetry and picturesqueness by demanding in their arrogance that the halberdier of the castle wait upon their table. I have, faithfully and conscientiously," says he, "performed my duties as a halberdier. I know nothing of a waiter's duties. It was the insolent whim of these transient pampered aristocrats that I should be detailed to serve them food. Must I be blamed? Must I be deprived of the means of a livelihood," he goes on account of an accident that was the result of their own presumption and haughtiness? "But what hurts me more than all," says Sir Percival, "is the desecration that has been done to this splendid RHEINSCHLOSS, the confiscation of its halberdier to serve menially at the banquet board." Even I could see that this stuff was piffle, but it caught the boss. "Mein Gott," says he, "you was right. Ein halberdier have not got der right to dish up soup. Him I will not discharge. Have another waiter if you like, und let mein halberdier go back and stand mit his halberd. But gentlemen," he says, pointing to the old man, "you go ahead and sue mit der dress. Sue me for $600 or $6,000, I stand der suit." And the boss puffs off downstairs. Old Brockman was an all-right Dutchman. Just then the clock strikes 12, and the old guy laughs loud. "You win, Deering," says he, "and let me explain to all," he goes on. "Some time ago Mr. Deering asked me for something that I did not want to give him. I looks at the girl, and she turns as red as a pickled beet. I told him," says the old guy, "if he would earn his own living for 3 months without being discharged for incompetence, I would give him what he wanted. It seems that the time was up at 12 o'clock tonight. I came near fetching you, though, Deering, on that soup question," says the old boy, standing up and grabbing Sir Percival's hand. The halberdier lets out a yell and jumps 3 feet high. "Look out for those hands," says he, and he holds them up. You never saw such hands except on a laborer in a limestone quarry. "Heavens, boy," says old Side Whiskers, "what have you been doing to 'em?" "Oh," says Percival, "little chores like hauling coal and excavating rock till they went back on me. And when I couldn't hold a pick or a whip, I took up halberdiering to give 'em a rest. Tureens full of hot soup don't seem to be a particularly soothing treatment." I would have bet on that girl. That high-tempered kind always go as far the other way, according to my experience. She whizzes round the table like a cyclone and catches both his hands in hers. "Poor hands, dear hands," she sings out and sheds tears on 'em and holds 'em close to her bosom. Well, sir, with all that RHEINSCHLOSS scenery, it was just like a play, and the halberdier sits down at the table at the girl's side, and I served the rest of the supper. And that was about all, except that when they left, he shed his hardware store and went with them. I dislike to be sidetracked from an original proposition. But you haven't told me, 18, says I, how the cigar case came to be broken. Oh, that was last night, said 18. Sir Percival and the girl drove up in a cream-colored motor car and had dinner in the RHEINSCHLOSS. The same table, Billy, I heard her say as they went up. I waited on 'em. We've got a new halberdier now, a bow-legged guy with a face like a sheep. As they came downstairs, Sir Percival passes him a 10-case note. The new halberdier drops his halberd, and it falls on the cigar case. That's how it happened. End of chapter 20. Chapter 21 of Roads of Destiny. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Scott Foster. Roads of Destiny by O. Henry. Chapter 21, Two Renegades. In the gate city of the South, the Confederate veterans were reuniting, and I stood to see them march, beneath the tangled flags of the great conflict, to the hall of their oratory and commemoration. While the irregular and halting line was passing, I made onslaught upon it and dragged from the ranks my friend Bernard O'Keefe, who had no right to be there, for he was a Northerner, born and bred. And what should he be doing hallooing for the stars and bars among those gray and moribund veterans? And why should he be trudging, with his shining, martial, humorous, broad face among those warriors of a previous and alien generation? I say I dragged him forth and held him till the last hickory leg and waving goatee had stumbled past. And then I hustled him out of the crowd into a cool interior, for the gate city was stirred that day, and the hand organs wisely eliminated marching through Georgia from their repertoires. Now what deviltry are you up to? I asked of O'Keefe when there were a table and things in glasses between us. O'Keefe wiped his heated face and instigated a commotion among the floating ice in his glass before he chose to answer. I am assisting at the wake, said he, of the only nation on earth that ever did me a good turn. As one gentleman to another, I am ratifying and celebrating the foreign policy of the late Jefferson Davis, as fine a statesman as ever settled the financial question of a country. Equal ratio, that was his platform, a barrel of money for a barrel of flour, a pair of $20 bills for a pair of boots, a hatful of currency for a new hat. Say, ain't that simple compared with WJB's little old oxidized plank? What talk is this? I asked. Your financial digression is merely a subterfuge. Why were you marching in the ranks of the Confederate veterans? Because, my lad, answered O'Keefe, the Confederate government in its might and power interposed to protect and defend Bernard O'Keefe against immediate and dangerous assassination at the hands of a bloodthirsty foreign country after the United States of America had overruled his appeal for protection and had instructed Private Security Cortelyou to reduce his estimate of the Republican majority for 1905 by 1 vote. Come, Barney, said I, the Confederate States of America has been out of existence nearly 40 years. You do not look older yourself. When was it that the deceased government exerted its foreign policy in your behalf? 4 months ago, said O'Keefe promptly. The infamous foreign power I alluded to is still staggering from the official blow dealt it by Mr. Davis's contraband aggregation of states. That's why you see me cakewalking with the ex-rebs to the illegitimate tune about Simmon seeds and cotton. I vote for the Great Father in Washington, but I am not going back on Mars's Jeff. You say the Confederacy has been dead 40 years? Well, if it hadn't been for it, I'd have been breathing today with soul so dead I couldn't have whispered a single cuss word about my native land. The O'Keefes are not overburdened with ingratitude. I must have looked bewildered. The war was over, I said vacantly, O'Keefe laughed loudly, scattering my thoughts. Ask old Doc Milliken if the war is over, he shouted, hugely diverted. Oh, no, Doc hasn't surrendered yet. And the Confederate States, well, I just told you they bucked officially and solidly and nationally against a foreign government 4 months ago and kept me from being shot. Old Jeff's country stepped in and brought me off under its wing, while Roosevelt was having a gunboat painted and waiting for the National Campaign Committee to look up whether I had ever scratched the ticket. Isn't there a story in this, Barney? I asked. No, said O'Keefe, but I'll give you the facts. You know I went down to Panama when this irritation about a canal began. I thought I'd get in on the ground floor. I did, and had to sleep on it, and drink water with little zoos in it. So, of course, I got the Chagres fever. That was in a little town called San Juan on the coast. After I got the fever hard enough to kill a Port-au-Prince nigger, I had a relapse in the shape of Doc Milliken. There was a doctor to attend a sick man. If Doc Milliken had your case, he made the terrors of death seem like an invitation to a donkey party. He had the bedside manners of a Paiute medicine man and the soothing presence of a dray loaded with iron bridge girders. When he laid his hand on your fevered brow, you felt like Cap John Smith just before Pocahontas went his bail. Well, this old medical outrage floated down to my shack when I sent for him. He was built like a shad, and his eyebrows was black, and his white whiskers trickled down from his chin like milk coming out of a sprinkling pot. He had a nigger boy along carrying an old tomato can full of calomel and a saw. Doc felt my pulse, and then he began to mess up some calomel with an agricultural implement that belonged to the trowel class. "I don't want any death mask made yet, Doc," I says, "nor my liver put in a plaster of Paris cast. I'm sick, and it's medicine I need, not frescoing." "You're a blame Yankee, ain't you?" asked Doc, going on mixing up his Portland cement. "I'm from the North," says I, "but I'm a plain man and don't care for mural decorations. When you get the isthmus all asphalted over with that boll weevil prescription, would you mind giving me a dose of painkiller or a little strychnine on toast to ease up this feeling of unhealthiness that I have got?" "They was all sassy, just like you," says old Doc. "But we lowered their temperature considerable. Yes, sir, I reckon we sent a good many of you over to old Mortuus Nisi Bonum. Look at Antietam and Bull Run and Seven Pines and around Nashville. There never was a battle where we didn't lick you unless you was 10 to our 1. I knew you were a blame Yankee the minute I laid eyes on you." "Don't reopen the chasm, Doc," I begs him. "Any Yankiness I may have is geographical, and as far as I'm concerned, a Southerner is as good as a Filipino any day. I'm feeling too bad to argue. Let's have secession without misrepresentation if you say so. But what I need is more laudanum and less Lundy's Lane. If you're mixing that compound gefloxide of gefloxicum for me, please fill my ears with it before you get around to the Battle of Gettysburg, for there is a subject full of talk." By this time, Doc Milliken had thrown up a line of fortifications on square pieces of paper, and he says to me, "Yank, take one of these powders every 2 hours. They won't kill you. I'll be around again about sundown to see if you're alive." Old Doc's powders knocked the Chagres. I stayed in San Juan and got to knowing him better. He was from Mississippi and the red-hottest Southerner that ever smelled mint. He made Stonewall Jackson and R.E. Lee look like abolitionists. He had a family somewhere down near Yazoo City, but he stayed away from the States on account of an uncontrollable liking he had for the absence of a Yankee government. Him and me got as thick personally as the Emperor of Russia and the Dove of Peace, but sectionally we didn't amalgamate. 'Twas a beautiful system of medical practice introduced by old Doc into that isthmus of land. He'd take that bracket saw and the mild chloride in his hypodermic and treat anything from yellow fever to a personal friend. Besides his other liabilities, Doc could play a flute for a minute or two. He was guilty of 2 tunes, Dixie and another one that was mighty close to the Swanee River. You might say one of its tributaries. He used to come down and sit with me while I was getting well and aggrieve his flute and say unreconstructed things about the North. You'd have thought that the smoke from the first gun at Fort Sumter was still floating around in the air. You know, that was about the time they staged them property revolutions down there that wound up in the 5th act with the thrilling canal scene where Uncle Sam has 9 curtain calls holding Miss Panama by the hand while the bloodhounds keep Senator Morgan treed up in a coconut palm. That's the way it wound up, but at first it seemed as if Columbia was going to make Panama look like one of the $3.98 kind, with dents made in it in the factory like they wear at North Beach fish fries. For mine, I played the straw hat crowd to win. And they gave me a colonel's commission over a brigade of 27 men in the left wing and second joint of the insurgent army. The Colombian troops were awfully rude to us. One day when I had my brigade in a sandy spot with its shoes off doing a battalion drill by squads, the government army rushed from behind a bush at us, acting as noisy and disagreeable as they could. My troops enfiladed left-faced and left the spot. After enticing the enemy for 3 miles or so, we struck a briar patch and had to sit down. When we were ordered to throw up our toes and surrender, we obeyed. 5 of my best staff officers fell, suffering extremely with stone-bruised heels. Then and there those Colombians took your friend Barney, sir, stripped him of the insignia of his rank, consisting of a pair of brass knuckles and a canteen of rum, and dragged him before a military court. The presiding general went through the usual legal formalities that sometimes cause a case to hang on the calendar of a South American military court as long as 10 minutes. He asked me my age, and then sentenced me to be shot. They woke up the court interpreter, an American named Jenks, who was in the rum business, and vice versa, and told him to translate the verdict. Jenks stretched himself and took a morphine tablet. "You've got to back up against the dobe, old man," says he to me. 3 weeks, I believe you get. Haven't got to chew a fine cut on you, have you? "Translate that again with footnotes and a glossary," says I. "I don't know whether I'm discharged, condemned, or handed over to the Jerry Society." "Oh," says Jenks, "don't you understand? You're to be stood up against a 'dobe wall and shot in 2 or 3 weeks. 3, I think they said." "Would you mind asking him which?" says I. "A week don't amount to much after you're dead, but it seems a real nice long spell while you're alive." "It's 2 weeks," says the interpreter after inquiring in Spanish of the court. "Shall I ask him again?" "Let be," says I. "Let's have a stationary verdict. If I keep on appealing this way, they'll have me shot about 10 days before I was captured. No, I haven't got any fine cut." They sends me over to the calaboza with a detachment of colored postal telegraph boys carrying Enfield rifles, and I am locked up in a kind of brick bakery. The temperature in there was just about the kind mentioned in the cooking recipes that call for a quick oven. Then I gives a silver dollar to one of the guards to send for the United States consul. He comes around in pajamas, with a pair of glasses on his nose and a dozen or two inside of them. "I'm to be shot in 2 weeks," says I, "and although I've made a memorandum of it, I don't seem to get it off my mind. You want to call up Uncle Sam on the cable as quick as you can and get him all worked up about it. Have him send the Kentucky and the Kearsarge and the Oregon down right away. That'll be about enough battleships, but it won't hurt to have a couple of cruisers and a torpedo boat destroyer, too. And, say, if Dewey isn't busy, better have him come along on the fastest one of the fleet." "Now see here, O'Keefe," says the consul, getting the best of a hiccup. "What do you want to bother the State Department about this matter for?" "Didn't you hear me?" says I. "I'm to be shot in 2 weeks. Did you think I said I was going to a lawn party? And it wouldn't hurt if Roosevelt could get the Japs to send down the Yellow Yamtaskukum or the Agota Sing Sing or some other first-class cruisers to help. It would make me feel safer." "Now, what you want," said the consul, "is not to get excited. I'll send you over some chewing tobacco and some banana fritters when I go back. The United States can't interfere in this. You know you were caught insurging against the government, and you're subject to the laws of this country. To tell the truth, I've had an intimation from the State Department, unofficially of course, that whenever a soldier of fortune demands a fleet of gunboats in a case of revolutionary katzenjammer, I should cut the cable, giving him all the tobacco he wants, and after he's shot, take his clothes, if they fit me, for part payment of my salary." "Consul," says I to him, "this is a serious question. You are representing Uncle Sam. This ain't any little international tomfoolery like a Universal Peace Congress or the christening of the Shamrock Four. I'm an American citizen, and I demand protection. I demand the Mosquito Fleet and Schley and the Atlantic Squadron and Bob Evans and General E. Bird Grubb and 2 or 3 protocols. What are you going to do about it?" "Nothing doing," says the consul. "Be off with you then," says I, out of patience with him, "and send me Doc Milliken. Ask Doc to come and see me." Doc comes and looks through the bars at me, surrounded by dirty soldiers, with even my shoes and canteen confiscated, and he looks mightily pleased. "Hello, Yank," says he. "Getting a little taste of Johnson's Island now, ain't ye?" "Doc," says I, "I've just had an interview with the U.S. consul. I gather from his remarks that I might just as well have been caught selling suspenders in Kishinev under the name of Rosenstein as to be in my present condition. It seems that the only maritime aid I am to receive from the United States is some Navy plug to chew. Doc," says I, "can't you suspend hostility on the slavery question long enough to do something for me?" "It ain't been my habit," Doc Milliken answers, "to do any painless dentistry when I find a Yank cutting an eye tooth. So the Stars and Stripes ain't lending any Marines to shell the huts of the Colombian cannibals, eh? Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light the Star-Spangled Banner is fluked in the fight? What's the matter with the War Department, eh? It's a great thing to be a citizen of a gold standard nation, ain't it?" "Rub it in, Doc, all you want," says I. "I guess we're weak on foreign policy." "For a Yank," says Doc, putting on his specs and talking more mild, "you ain't so bad. If you had come from below the line, I reckon I would have liked you right smart. Now, since your country has gone back on you, you have to come to the old doctor whose cotton you burned and whose mules you stole and whose niggers you freed to help you. Ain't that so, Yank?" "It is," says I heartily, "and let's have a diagnosis of the case right away, for in 2 weeks' time all you can do is to hold an autopsy, and I don't want to be amputated if I can help it." "Now," says Doc businesslike, "it's easy enough for you to get out of this scrape. Money'll do it. You've got to pay a long string of 'em from General Pomposo down to this anthropoid ape guarding your door. About $10,000 will do the trick. Have you got the money?" "Me?" says I. "I've got $1 2 real pieces, and a medio." "If you've any last words, utter 'em," says that old reb. "The roster of your financial budget sounds quite much to me like the noise of a requiem." "Change the treatment," says I. "I admit that I'm short. Call a consultation or use radium or smuggle me in some saws or something." "Yank," says Doc Milliken, "I've a good notion to help you. There's only one government in the world that can get you out of this difficulty, and that's the Confederate States of America, the grandest nation that ever existed." "Just as you said to me," I says to Doc, "why, the Confederacy ain't a nation. It's been absolved 40 years ago." "That's a campaign lie," says Doc. "She's running along as solid as the Roman Empire. She's the only hope you've got. Now you, being a Yank, have got to go through with some preliminary obsequies before you can get official aid. You've got to take the oath of allegiance to the Confederate government. Then I'll guarantee she does all she can for you. What do you say, Yank? It's your last chance." "If you're fooling with me, Doc," I answers, "you're no better than the United States. But as you say, it's the last chance. So hurry up and swear me. I always did like corn, whiskey, and possum anyhow. I believe I'm half Southerner by nature. I'm willing to try the Ku Klux in place of the khaki. Get brisk." Doc Milliken thinks a while, and then he offers me this oath of allegiance to take without any kind of a chaser. "I, Bernard O'Keefe, Yank, being of sound body but a Republican mind, hereby swear to transfer my fealty, respect, and allegiance to the Confederate States of America and the government thereof in consideration of said government, through its official acts and powers, obtaining my freedom and release from confinement and sentence of death brought about by the exuberance of my Irish proclivities and my general peasanness as a Yank." I repeated these words after Doc, but they seemed to me a kind of hocus-pocus, and I don't believe any life insurance company in the world would have issued me a policy on the strength of them. Doc went away saying he would communicate with his government immediately. Say, you can imagine how I felt. Me to be shot in 2 weeks, and my only hope for help being in a government that's been dead so long that it isn't even remembered except on Decoration Day and when Joe Wheeler signs the voucher for his paycheck. But it was all there was in sight. And somehow I thought Doc Milliken had something up his old alpaca sleeve that wasn't all foolishness. Around to the jail comes old Doc again in about a week. I was flea-bitten, a mite sarcastic, and fundamentally hungry. "Any Confederate ironclads in the offing?" I asks. "Do you notice any sounds resembling the approach of Jeb Stuart's cavalry overland or Stonewall Jackson sneaking up in the rear? If you do, I wish you'd say so." "It's too soon yet for help to come," says Doc. "The sooner the better," says I. "I don't care if it gets in fully 15 minutes before I am shot, and if you happen to lay eyes on Beauregard or Albert Sidney Johnson or any of the relief corps, wig-wag 'em to hike along." "There's been no answer received yet," says Doc. "Don't forget," says I, "that there's only 4 days more. I don't know how you propose to work this thing, Doc," I says to him, "but it seems to me I'd sleep better if you had got a government that was alive and on the map, like Afghanistan or Great Britain or Old Man Kruger's kingdom, to take this matter up. I don't mean any disrespect to your Confederate States, but I can't help feeling that my chances of being pulled out of this scrape was decidedly weakened when General Lee surrendered." "It's your only chance," said Doc. "Don't quarrel with it. What did your own country do for you?" It was only 2 days before the morning I was to be shot when Doc Milliken came around again. "All right, Yank," says he, "help's come. The Confederate States of America is going to apply for your release. The representatives of the government arrived on a fruit steamer last night." "Bully," says I. "Bully for you, Doc. I suppose it's Marines with a Gatling. I'm going to love your country all I can for this." "Negotiations," says old Doc, "will be opened between the two governments at once. You will know later today if they are successful." About 4 in the afternoon, a soldier in red trousers brings a paper round to the jail, and they unlocks the door, and I walks out. The guard at the door bows and I bows, and I steps into the grass and wades around to Doc Milliken's shack. Doc was sitting in his hammock playing Dixie, soft and low and out of tune on his flute. I interrupted him at look away, and shook his hand for 5 minutes. "I never thought," says Doc, taking a chew fretfully, "that I'd ever try to save any blame Yank's life. But, Mr. O'Keefe, I don't see but what you are entitled to be considered part human anyhow. I never thought Yanks had any of the rudiments of decorum and laudability about 'em. I reckon I might have been too aggregative in my tabulation. But it ain't me you want to thank. It's the Confederate States of America." "And I'm much obliged to him," says I. "It's a poor man that wouldn't be patriotic with a country that saved his life. I'll drink to the stars and bars whenever there's a flagstaff and a glass convenient. But where," says I, "are the rescuing troops? If there was a gun fired or a shell burst, I didn't hear it." Doc Milliken raises up and points out the window with his flute at the banana steamer loading with fruit. "Yank," says he, "there's a steamer that's going to sail in the morning. If I was you, I'd sail on it. The Confederate government's done all it can for you. There wasn't a gun fired. The negotiations were carried on secretly between the two nations by the purser of that steamer. I got him to do it because I didn't want to appear in it. $12,000 was paid to the officials in bribes to let you go." "Man," says I, sitting down hard, "12,000! How will I ever? Who could have? Where did the money come from?" "Yazoo City," says Doc Milliken. "I've got a little saved up there. 2 barrels full. It looks good to these Colombians. 'Twas Confederate money, every dollar of it. Now do you see why you'd better leave before they try to pass some of it on an expert?" "I do," says I. "Now let's hear you give the password," says Doc Milliken. "Hurrah for Jeff Davis," says I. "Correct," says Doc, "and let me tell you something. The next tune I learn on my flute is going to be Yankee Doodle. I reckon there's some Yanks that are not so peasin'. Or if you was me, would you try the red, white, and blue?" End of chapter 21. Chapter 22 of Roads of Destiny. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Scott Foster. Roads of Destiny by O. Henry. Chapter 22, The Lonesome Road. Brown as a coffee berry, rugged, pistoled, spurred, wary, indefeasible, I saw my old friend Deputy Marshal Buck Caperton stumble, with jingling rowels, into a chair in the marshal's outer office. And because the courthouse was almost deserted at that hour, and because Buck would sometimes relate to me things that were out of print, I followed him in and tricked him into talk through knowledge of a weakness he had. For cigarettes rolled with sweet corn husk were as honey to Buck's palate, and though he could finger the trigger of a .45 with skill and suddenness, he never could learn to roll a cigarette. It was through no fault of mine, for I rolled the cigarettes tight and smooth, but the upshot of some whim of his own that instead of to an Odyssey of the Chaparral, I listened to a dissertation upon matrimony. This from Buck Caperton. But I maintain that the cigarettes were impeccable and crave absolution for myself. "We just brought in Jim and Bud Granberry," says Buck. "Train robbing, you know. Held up the Aransas Pass last month. We caught 'em in the 20-mile pear flat south of the Nueces." "Have much trouble corralling them?" I asked, for here was the meat that my hunger for epics craved. "Some," said Buck, and then, during a little pause, his thoughts stampeded off the trail. "It's kind of queer about women," he went on, "and the place they're supposed to occupy in botany. If I was asked to classify them, I'd say they was a human loco weed. Ever see a bronc that had been chewing loco? Ride him up to a puddle of water 2 feet wide and he'll give a snort and fall back on you. It looks as big as the Mississippi River to him. Next trip, he'd walk into a canyon 1,000 feet deep thinking it was a prairie dog hole. Same way with a married man. I was thinking of Perry Roundtree. That used to be my sidekicker before he committed matrimony. In them days, me and Perry hated indisturbances of any kind. We roamed around considerable, stirring up the echoes and making 'em attend to business. Why, when me and Perry wanted to have some fun in a town, it was a picnic for the census takers. They just counted the marshal's posse that it took to subdue us, and there was your population. But then there came along this Mariana Goodnight girl and looked at Perry sideways, and he was all bridle-wise and saddle-broke before you could skin a yearling. I wasn't even asked to the wedding. I reckon the bride had my pedigree and the front elevation of my habits all mapped out, and she decided that Perry would trot better in double harness without any unconverted Mustang like Buck Caperton wickering around on the matrimonial range. So it was 6 months before I saw Perry again. One day I was passing on the edge of town, and I see something like a man in a little yard by a little house with a sprinkling pot squirting water on a rose bush. Seemed to me I'd seen something like it before, and I stopped at the gate, trying to figure out its brands. 'Twas not Perry Roundtree, but 'twas the kind of a curdled jellyfish matrimony had made out of him. Homicide was what that Mariana had perpetrated. He was looking well enough, but he had on a white collar and shoes, and you could tell in a minute that he'd speak polite and pay taxes and stick his little finger out while drinking, just like a sheep man or a citizen. Great skyrockets, but I hated to see Perry all corrupted and willy-eyed like that. He came out to the gate and shook hands, and I says with scorn and speaking like a paroquet with the pip, "Beg pardon, Mr. Roundtree, I believe. Seems to me I satiated in your associations once, if I am not mistaken." "Oh, go to the devil, Buck," says Perry, polite as I was afraid he'd be. "Well, then," says I, "you poor contaminated adjunct of a sprinkling pot and degraded household pet, what did you go and do it for? Look at you, all decent and unriotous, and only fit to sit on juries and mend the woodhouse door. You was a man once. I have hostility for all such acts. Why don't you go in the house and count the tidies or set the clock and not stand out here in the atmosphere? A jackrabbit might come along and bite you." "Now, Buck," says Perry, speaking mild and some sorrowful, "you don't understand. A married man has got to be different. He feels different from a tough old cloudburst like you. It's sinful to waste time pulling up towns just to look at the roots and playing faro and looking upon red liquor and such restless policies as them." "There was a time," I says, and I expect I sighed when I mentioned it, "when a certain domesticated little Mary's lamb I could name was some instructed himself in the line of pernicious sprightliness. I never expected, Perry, to see you reduced down from a full-grown pestilence to such a frivolous fraction of a man. Why," says I, "you've got a necktie on, and you speak of a senseless kind of indoor drivel that reminds me of a storekeeper or a lady. You look to me like you might tote an umbrella and wear suspenders and go home of nights." "The little woman," says Perry, "has made some improvements, I believe. You can't understand, Buck. I haven't been away from the house at night since we was married." We talked on a while, me and Perry, and as sure as I live, that man interrupted me in the middle of my talk to tell me about 6 tomato plants he had growing in his garden. Shoved his agricultural degradation right up under my nose while I was telling him about the fun we had tarring and feathering that faro dealer at California Pete's layout. But by and by Perry shows a flicker of sense. "Buck," says he, "I'll have to admit that it is a little dull at times. Not that I'm not perfectly happy with the little woman, but a man seems to require some excitement now and then. Now, I'll tell you, Mariana's gone visiting this afternoon, and she won't be home till 7 o'clock. That's the limit for both of us, 7 o'clock. Neither of us ever stays out a minute after that time unless we are together. Now, I'm glad you came along, Buck," says Perry, "for I'm feeling just like having one more rip-roaring razoo with you for the sake of old times. What you say to us putting in the afternoon having fun? I'd like it fine," says Perry. I slapped that old captive range rider half across his little garden. "Get your hat, you old dried-up alligator," I shouts. "You ain't dead yet. You're part human anyhow, if you did get all bogged up in matrimony. We'll take this town to pieces and see what makes it tick. We'll make all kinds of profligate demands upon the science of cork-pulling. You'll grow horns yet, old muley cow," says I, punching Perry in the ribs, "if you trot around on the trail of vice with your Uncle Buck." "I'll have to be home by 7, you know," says Perry again. "Oh, yes," says I, winking to myself, for I knew the kind of 7 o'clocks Perry Roundtree got back by after he once got to passing repartee with the bartenders. We goes down to the Grey Mule Saloon, that old 'dobe building by the depot. "Give it a name," says I, as soon as we got one hoof on the footrest. "Sarsaparilla," says Perry. You could have knocked me down with a lemon peeling. "Insult me as much as you want to," I says to Perry, "but don't startle the bartender. He may have heart disease. Come on now, your tongue got twisted. The tall glasses," I orders, "and the bottle on the left-hand corner of the ice chest." "Sarsaparilla," repeats Perry, and then his eyes get animated, and I see he's got some great scheme in his mind he wants to emit. "Buck," says he, all interested, "I'll tell you what. I want to make this a red-letter day. I've been keeping close at home, and I want to turn myself loose. We'll have the highest old time you ever saw. We'll go in the back room here and play checkers till 6:30. I leaned against the bar, and I says to gotch-eared Mike, who was on watch, "For God's sake, don't mention this. You know what Perry used to be. He's had the fever, and the doctor says we must humor him." "Give us the checkerboard and the men, Mike," says Perry. "Come on, Buck, I'm just wild to have some excitement." I went in the back room with Perry. Before we closed the door, I says to Mike, "Don't ever let it straggle out from under your hat that you seen Buck Caperton fraternal with sarsaparilla or persona grata with a checkerboard, or I'll make a swallow fork in your other ear." I locked the door, and me and Perry played checkers. To see that poor old humiliated piece of household bric-a-brac sitting there and sniggering out loud whenever he jumped a man, and all obnoxious with animation when he got into my king row, would have made a sheepdog sick with mortification. Him that was once satisfied only when he was pegging 6 boards at Keno or giving the faro dealers nervous prostration. To see him pushing them checkers about like Sally Louisa at a school children's party, why, I was all smothered up with mortification. And I sits there playing the black men, all sweating for fear somebody I knew would find it out. And I thinks to myself some about this marrying business and how it seems to be the same kind of a game as that Mrs. Delilah played. She give her old man a haircut, and everybody knows what a man's head looks like after a woman cuts his hair. And then when the Pharisees came around to guy him, he was so shamed that he went to work and kicked the whole house down on top of the whole outfit. Them married men, thinks I, lose all their spirit and instinct for riot and foolishness. They won't drink, they won't buck the tiger, they won't even fight. What do they want to go and stay married for, I asks myself. But Perry seems to be having hilarity in considerable quantities. "Buck, old hoss," says he, "isn't this just the hell-roaringest time we ever had in our lives? I don't know when I've been stirred up so. You see, I've been sticking pretty close to home since I married, and I haven't been on a spree in a long time." Spree, yes, that's what he called it. Playing checkers in the back room of the Grey Mule. I suppose it did seem to him a little immoral and nearer to a prolonged debauch than standing over 6 tomato plants with a sprinkling pot. Every little bit, Perry looks at his watch and says, "I got to be home, you know, Buck, at 7. "All right," I'd say, "romp along and move. This here excitement's killing me. If I don't reform some and loosen up the strain of this checkered dissipation, I won't have a nerve left." It might have been 6:30 when commotions began to go on outside in the street. We heard a yelling and a 6-shootering and a lot of galloping and maneuvers. "What's that?" I wonders. "Oh, some nonsense outside," said Perry. "It's your move. We just got time to play this game." "I'll just take a peep through the window," says I, "and see. You can't expect a mere mortal to stand the excitement of having a king jumped and listen to an unidentified conflict going on at the same time." The Grey Mule Saloon was one of them old Spanish 'dobe buildings, and the back room had only 2 little windows a foot wide with iron bars in 'em. I looked out one, and I see the cause of the ruckus. There was the Trimble gang, 10 of 'em. The worst outfit of desperados and horse thieves in Texas, coming up the street, shooting right and left. They was coming right straight for the Grey Mule. Then they got past the range of my sight, but we heard 'em ride up to the front door, and then they socked the place full of lead. We heard the big looking-glass behind the bar knocked all to pieces and the bottles crashing. We could see gotch-eared Mike in his apron running across the plaza like a coyote, with the bullets puffing up dust all around him. Then the gang went to work in the saloon, drinking what they wanted and smashing what they didn't. Me and Perry both knew that gang, and they knew us. The year before Perry married, him and me was in the same ranger company, and we fought that outfit down on the San Miguel and brought back Ben Trimble and 2 others for murder. "We can't get out," says I. "We'll have to stay in here till they leave." Perry looked at his watch. 25 to 7, says he. "We can finish that game. I got 2 men on you. It's your move, Buck. I got to be home at 7, you know." We sat down and went on playing. The Trimble gang had a rough house for sure. They were getting good and drunk. They'd drink a while and holler a while, and then they'd shoot up a few bottles and glasses. 2 or 3 times they came and tried to open our door. Then there was some more shooting outside, and I looked out the window again. Ham Gossett, the town marshal, had a posse in the houses and stores across the street and was trying to bag a Trimble or 2 through the windows. I lost that game of checkers. I'm free in saying I lost 3 kings that I might have saved if I had been corralled in a more peaceful pasture. But that driveling married man sat there and cackled when he won a man like an unintelligent hen picking up a grain of corn. When the game was over, Perry gets up and looks at his watch. "I've had a glorious time, Buck," says he, "but I'll have to be going now. It's 6:45, and I got to be home by 7, you know." I thought he was joking. They'll clear out or be dead drunk in half an hour or an hour, says I. You ain't that tired of being married that you want to commit any more sudden suicide, are you? Says I, giving him the laugh. One time, says Perry, I was half an hour late getting home. I met Mariana on the street looking for me. If you could have seen her, Buck, but you don't understand. She knows what a wild kind of a snoozer I've been, and she's afraid something will happen. I'll never be late getting home again. I'll say goodbye to you now, Buck. I got between him and the door. Married man, says I know you was christened a fool the minute the preacher tangled you up, but don't you never sometimes think one little minute on a human basis? There's 10 of that gang in there, and they're peasing with whiskey and desire for murder. They'll drink you up like a bottle of booze before you get halfway to the door. Be intelligent now and use at least wild hog sense. Sit down and wait till we have some chance to get out without being carried in baskets. I got to be home by 7, Buck, repeats this henpecked thing of little wisdom like an unthinking poll parrot. Mariana, says he, will be out looking for me. And he reaches down and pulls a leg out of the checker table. I'll go through this Trimble outfit, says he, like a cottontail through a brush corral. I'm not pestered anymore with a desire to engage in ruckuses, but I got to be home by 7. You lock the door after me, Buck, and don't you forget, I won 3 out of them 5 games. I'd play longer, but Mariana... Hush up, you old locoed road runner, I interrupts. Did you ever notice your Uncle Buck locking doors against trouble? I'm not married, says I, but I'm as big a damn fool as any Mormon. 1 from 4 leaves 3, says I, and I gathers out another leg of the table. We'll get home by 7, says I, whether it's the heavenly one or the other. May I see you home, says I, you sarsaparilla drinking checker playing glutton for death and destruction. We opened the door easy, and then stampeded for the front. Part of the gang was lined up at the bar, part of them was passing over the drinks, and 2 or 3 was peeping out the door and window taking shots at the marshal's crowd. The room was so full of smoke we got halfway to the front door before they noticed us. Then I heard Barry Trimble's voice somewhere yell out, "How'd that Buck Caperton get in here?" And he skinned the side of my neck with a bullet. I reckon he felt bad over that miss, for Barry's the best shot south of the Southern Pacific Railroad. But the smoke in the saloon was some too thick for good shooting. Me and Perry smashed over 2 of the gang with our table legs, which didn't miss like the guns did, and as we ran out the door I grabbed a Winchester from a fellow who was watching the outside, and I turned and regulated the account of Mr. Barry. Me and Perry got out and around the corner all right. I never much expected to get out, but I wasn't going to be intimidated by that married man. According to Perry's idea, checkers was the event of the day. But if I am any judge of gentle recreations, that little table leg parade through the Grey Mule Saloon deserved the headlines in the bill of particulars. Walk fast, says Perry. It's 2 minutes to 7, and I got to be home by... Oh, shut up, says I. I had an appointment as a chief performer at an inquest at 7, and I'm not kicking about not keeping it. I had to pass by Perry's little house. His Mariana was standing at the gate. We got there at 5 minutes past 7. She had on a blue wrapper, and her hair was pulled back smooth like little girls do when they want to look grown folksy. She didn't see us till we got close, for she was gazing up the other way. Then she backed around and saw Perry, and a kind of look scooted around over her face. Danged if I can describe it. I heard her breathe long, just like a cow when you turn her calf in the lot, and she says, "You're late, Perry." 5 minutes, says Perry, cheerful. Me and old Buck was having a game of checkers. Perry introduces me to Mariana, and they ask me to come in. No, siree. I'd had enough truck with married folks for that day. I says I'll be going along and that I've spent a very pleasant afternoon with my old partner. Especially, says I, just to jostle Perry, during that game when the table legs came all loose. But I'd promised him not to let her know anything. I've been worrying over that business ever since it happened, continued Buck. There's one thing about it that's got me all twisted up, and I can't figure it out. What was that? I asked as I rolled and handed Buck the last cigarette. Why, I'll tell you. When I saw the look that little woman gave Perry when she turned round and saw him coming back to the ranch safe, why was it I got the idea all in a minute that that look of hers was worth more than the whole caboodle of us, sarsaparilla, checkers, and all, and that the damn fool in the game wasn't named Perry Roundtree at all? End of chapter 22. End of Roads of Destiny by O. Henry.